Hello, I'm Michael Voris.
And I'm Father Pablo, Catholic missionary priest. We really want you to watch every week the one true faith. Had you left that one true faith, please come home. We're waiting for you because we love you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the One True Faith. Welcome back to the One True Faith. You know, we say this show is the most disturbing hour of television that there is because we talk about where you're going to spend eternity, where I'm going to spend eternity. That is the most important topic of any of our lives. It's the only thing that matters in the end. Yeah, we have our drudgeries and we have to move through this life and do our things, but whatever greatness we accomplish and heights we scale to here, or bottoms and depths and sufferings we endure here, mean nothing in eternity. They mean nothing compared to eternity. What happens in the next life is all that matters to us. And that's a very, very, very hard message to get across to a secular world just swimming in materialism. Consumerism, materialism, hedonism. This culture has become pagan. This culture has become pagan. And part of the responsibility for that lies on us. We have let it become pagan. We've let it become pagan because of our own selfishness, because of our own short-sightedness, because of our own, ultimately, our own lack of charity. We have not kept faithful to what Jesus has commanded us to keep faithful to. And because of that, we have seen the world slowly slide into this abyss. We aren't the only cause of it, but we haven't done much to help stop it. I know that's the case for me, and I know that's the case for other people as well. We need to be better Christians. We need to be better in the sense of holier. That is why we are here on earth, to be holy. Jesus didn't command us to go make a bunch of money. He didn't command us to go be successful. He didn't command us to produce awesome television shows. What he commanded us to do was be perfect. Be perfect. That is quite the task. That's quite the task. We have to become holier. Every one of us. We have to become models of holiness. When we are not holy, things go wrong. And in Christianity, one of the big things that has gone wrong is the division among people who say they have the same faith. That is a sin. On the night before our blessed Lord died, he prayed to the Father, "Father, I pray that they all may be one, as you and I are one, so that the world may know that you sent me." What kind of testimony are we giving to the world? That there's this division in the heart of Christianity. What kind of testimony is that? How can we expect a world drowning in sin to look to us as any sort of role model when we can't even put our own differences aside? We must become holier. And you do not become holier or holy without humility, without accepting what God sends our way, be it good or bad, thankful for the good things and accepting of the bad things. And that's what we need to do, and we're not doing that. As Catholic Christians, we aren't doing that. We're not alone. There's other Christians that also are not doing it, but we're talking about Catholics right now. Let's talk about first things first. Division comes from one source. Division comes from one source, and that source is hell, is Satan, period. Division among Christians comes from the father of lies and deceit and division. Divide and conquer. That's his prayer. Father, that they all may be one, is the prayer of the Son of God. If we claim to be on the side of the Son of God, that's our prayer, and we should be doing that. We need to hold ourselves up as models to the world. And I don't mean just hold ourselves up superficially. I mean be models to the world of unity and charity and love. And that means every one of us will have to give away a little bit of ourselves. Don't we do this in our families? Don't we do this in our families? Don't we do this with people we love already? Everybody gives up a little bit of themselves for somebody that they love. If you don't, it's going to be a really short relationship. We need to do this, and we're not doing it. We're going to talk today about the split in the church between the Orthodox or the Eastern churches and the Latin or Western Rite churches. We'll go through a little bit of history, and then we'll go through some of the theological differences, and we'll talk about what the impact of these things really mean in today's world. We have to talk history. Don't be scared. Don't turn off the TV. It's not that big of a terrible fright. It's just some historical footnotes. This is not going to be an exhaustive classroom sort of thing on everything that's gone wrong between the Orthodox and the Christians, but we have to acknowledge that there were problems that happened and they need to be addressed and fixed, but we need to know that's all fine 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. What does that mean for us today? Because we need to be a sign to the world. The church must be unified and must be a sacramental sign to the world. Father, I pray that they all may be one, as you and I are one, so that the world may know that you sent me. As long as we are divided, the world will not look at us and say, yep, that's right. See how they love one another. Well, they're no better off than I am. Every time they have a fight and a quarrel, they split and they go off and do their own thing. Why should I not get divorced, remarried 6 times? Those people over there that profess that faith, they do essentially the same thing in their own religion. Father, that they all may be one as you and I are one. It's a very key, critical point. Jesus said that hours before the Garden of Gethsemane, as his agony was beginning to well up inside him at the Last Supper. When he said that is a significant point. Didn't just blurt it out somewhere along the trail 2 or 3 years earlier. He said it as his sacred passion was beginning. And the splits and the divisions in Christianity, imagine the pain and the suffering that rent his blessed heart with, his sacred heart. We are doing that to him presently. Presently. We must make peace and find a way to heal the divisions. That is a divine command. There is an awful lot more historical and political baggage between the Orthodox, the Eastern churches, and the Western churches than there is theological. There are some theological differences, absolutely. We'll get to those in a bit. But most of the divisions between the East and the West are historical divisions and political divisions. We'll go over a few of them. Let's do a little history. The Emperor Constantine comes to the throne in Rome in 313, legalizes Christianity. About 15 years later, he says, you know what, I want to take my capital and I want to move it to Constantinople. So all of a sudden, all of the glory and riches and powers, and it's like picking up Washington, D.C. and moving it to New York. That's sort of what happened. You move over there, all the influence, all the power, everything goes in there. One of the reasons that Constantine picked up his capital and moved it is because the West, on its fringes, in sort of Central Europe and from the Mediterranean, the West was beginning to crumble and fray a little bit from the attacks from the barbarians and all that. He said, let's move the empire over here. Let's move the seat of power to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. Let's move all of our power over there. After he died, the empire was cut in two, and it became the Western Rite, or the Western and the Eastern Empire. About 100 years later is when the empire in the West is sort of historically given its death knell. In history books, it officially came to an end in 476, I believe it is, or 480, when Octavius, the last Roman emperor in the West, just kind of went into retirement. Hopped on a boat, went on an island, sat there and wrote a few songs and poems and died, and that was the end of the empire in the West, as it was being overrun by barbarians and everyone else. In the East, however, a lot of people don't realize this. They think of the Roman Empire in Rome. I guess that's a natural inclination, but they don't realize that historically the Roman Empire continued in the East for another 1,000 years. Another 1,000 years. Historians have referred to that Eastern Empire as Byzantium, but that's a term that the people who lived there at the time, they would have known nothing about it. That term, Byzantine and Byzantium, never even worked its way into historical accounts until the 15th and 16th centuries. They didn't walk around saying, oh, Octavius retired, so now I'm a Byzantine. They were just the Roman Empire, and we have an emperor. And that emperor, and here's where the problem starts to set in. The emperor in the East is still the Roman emperor. He still considers himself Caesar. And the patriarch, the head of the church, the bishop, if you want to say that, in Constantinople, and the emperor start to have these little scenes with each other. A lesson that the West, in the person of the Pope and the different kings of Europe, would find out in a couple of centuries. That there is this constant tension between church and state, between who's doing the appointing of bishops, who's collecting the taxes, who's in charge, and that constant tension already had begun in the East, but it was a pretty good indicator of what was about to happen a century or two later in the West. Almost all of the problems and the wars and everything that happened in Europe, in Western Europe, what we think of as Western European history, happened as a result of these constant tensions between church and state, church and state. Now, in the early church, in the early days, the first few centuries of church, there were 5 major cities where the church was seen as being most important, sort of the 5 most important seats, so to speak. There was Rome in the west, Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey, Jerusalem, which is obviously in Jerusalem, in modern-day Israel, and Alexandria in modern-day Egypt. 4 of those, with the exception of Rome, those 4 were in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, if we want to call it that. Rome was alone. It sat outside in the West and had its own world to be dealing with. It had Attila the Hun winding up at the gates, barbarians left and right, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the list is endless of the barbarians that the West had to deal with. They had a whole different set of circumstances to live with than those in the East did. Only Rome was in the West. Now this is significant. Only Rome was in the West. The others were all in the East. And from the beginning, because the power in the East was there and was being influenced, the church in the East immediately had to deal with this headache of trying to have a good relationship, a working relationship with the emperor. The emperor wanted to appoint the patriarchs. The emperor wanted to have control over this. The patriarchs sort of fought back. No, you're kind of interfering in church business. That tension immediately begins in the East. Well, because of that, that sort of begins to set a tempo in the East. That there is this tension, there is this constant having to sort of politically bargain off this or that. Now, again, the West was not going to be immune from this. This whole thing would creep up in about 200 or 300 years in the West as well. The East just dealt with it sooner. Because the patriarch in the East had to sort of always continually assert his own power and his own authority to sort of, in the church, to sort of give him leverage against the emperor, that oftentimes caused conflicts with Rome. First one came in the 4th century when the emperor appoints a patriarch, and notice who did the appointing there, when the emperor appoints a patriarch who's a heretic. He's an Arian. Pope Julian goes, you're excommunicated. All of a sudden, the first schism, if you want to call it that, happens in the church. The first break happens between East and West. And it would last for about 50 years until who becomes the Patriarch of Constantinople? St. John Chrysostom. And then they're restored. So don't start thinking that there's this big division between East and West and it just sort of came out of nowhere. There are historical things of this all the way back. Go all the way back, as a matter of fact, in Christianity to St. Paul's letters. Open up St. Paul's letters, and the whole thing is about brothers, sisters, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. One group of you is off over here doing that. Another group is off here doing it. The whole history of Christianity, almost from the very beginning, begins with these divisions and these breaks, and the group of people whom Jesus has appointed to say, no, come back to the fold, believe this, this is what you're supposed to believe, you're wandering, come back. That's half of what St. Paul's letters are. Constantly. I mean, those letters are written to Christians. They're not written to people who are learning about the faith for the first time. Those are people where he's gone and established churches. He no sooner walks out the door and they immediately start breaking up. Well, I'm going to believe this, I'm going to believe that. Look at what the early apostles went through over the debate over circumcision. They hadn't even left Jerusalem yet, and they're already, half of them are saying this and the other half are saying that. It's not surprising that when you throw human beings into the mix, you get division. That's why we are constantly calling on Jesus and heaven to help us heal these divisions. Because left to our own devices, look what we get. Look at the world around us. This is what we get when we forget God. We get the world we deserve. And if you're complaining about the world here, well, I would say, and for myself also, take a good hard look in the mirror. That's the first place to be looking, is in the mirror. 1054 becomes the big date in history. 1054. It's actually kind of a mistaken notion, but we'll go with it for a moment. 1054, the Normans invade southern Italy, where there was a whole Byzantine Greek presence. The empire was still in southern Italy. The Normans invade, and for some inexplicable reason, the Normans go to the Greek communities, the Greek parishes, the Greek churches, the Greek rite, and say, you know, in the West, we use unleavened bread for communion, for the Eucharist. You guys are going to start doing that. And they're like, no, we use leavened bread. They're like, no, see my sword? I'm the guy. You're using unleavened bread. Well, this report goes back to the Patriarch of Constantinople, who says, okay, well, two can play this game. All of the Latin Rite churches in Constantinople, you are going to start using leavened bread. If you won't let us use leavened bread over there, we're not going to let you use unleavened bread over here. We are so stupid. Humanity is so stupid. I will bet you, if there was a way to dig into this, I will bet you there was some little, you know what kind of match I'm going to say, going on between these people about, oh, I'm better than you are. And you know that there was some kind of personal thing going on here. And we're all giggling because we all know that we would be just the same way, and we can think of 38 other people who would be just the same way. So the Latin churches in Constantinople turn around and say, no, we are not going to do that. So he closes the churches. Well, that prompts and he closes the churches, and he writes that he closes the Latin churches, and he sends a letter off to the Pope at the time. And the Pope is very, it wasn't the politest of letters. It was kind of like, you and I are sort of equal here, and I'm closing your churches. So the Pope's like, okay, we've been doing this for hundreds of years. Okay, and he puts this little three-man commission together, puts them on a boat, and says, go to Constantinople. It's led by a cardinal and a couple of legates, and the legate gets over there, his assistants, and they're sort of diplomatic for about the first 10 minutes with each other. And then all hell breaks loose. They start being rude to each other. There's this sort of constant cultural tension going on between each other. And the cardinal writes a bull of excommunication and slams it down on the altar in the cathedral, in the Holy Church of Wisdom. Not particularly a wise thing to do, to walk into the Church of Wisdom and excommunicate your host, but he does. Well, a synod in the Byzantine Church, in the Eastern Church, doesn't think that's the politest thing to do, so they turn around and excommunicate him and his two buddies. And they got on a boat, and they go back, and there we go. And when we come back, we'll talk about what happened afterwards. Take a look around us, we'll be able to figure out what happened after. So we'll be right back right after this. Now, what's important to recognize here is during this little, multiple excommunication thing going on, what's important to note is what did not happen. What did not happen. Neither church excommunicated the other church. That did not happen. A lot of people ascribed, the church, the Catholics excommunicated. You got to be very careful when you use words here. The Catholic cardinal wrote an excommunication of the patriarch. The synod wrote an excommunication of the cardinal and his two friends from Rome. That's who got excommunicated, not the churches. This is a very, very key point. But this happens in 1054, and a number of, there's a sort of constant tensions between East and West. Think of it in terms of like our North and South in the United States. The North thinks it's all, high and mighty and cultured, and the South is full of hicks and all that, and they can't, do anything except, play country music and feed their hound dog something. And it's this sort of like cultural elitism versus like backwoods hillbilly sort of thing, which is how East and West begin to see each other in Europe. It sort of stayed this way, of this sort of constant tension back and forth. It was finally when the Turks, the Muslims, came in the form of the Ottoman Empire and crushed down on what was at the time the sort of the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. What happened to Rome in the West, sort of fraying at the edges with the different barbarian attacks until it finally collapsed? is pretty much what happened in the East just 1,000 years later, except this time it wasn't barbarians attacking, it was Muslims who had been kind of chewing at the perimeter of the Byzantine Empire for a very long time. Now there are all sorts of things going on with the Crusades and a lot of misunderstanding and who's defending who and who's, once the Western Crusaders would come into the Byzantine Empire and take control of this or that. Well, who had it? Was it supposed to go back to there was a lot of all. But notice, none of this is theological. None of this is theological. This is all kibitzing and going over each other about, that's my land, that's my thing, I'm the king, I'm the boss, I write the thing, you do the. None of this is theological. It's all squabbling over who has the money, who appoints the bishops, who does the king, who's all of these things. It's not about theology. If we're gonna, if the Catholics in the West and the Orthodox in the East are gonna have a religious war, have a good one like the Protestants had with us, for God's sake, over theology. Don't have one over who's in charge of painting the wall this week. It's these historical, political breaks. It is not theological. There are theological elements to it, and we'll get to those, like I said. But understand that what's going on is that the Turks come in, essentially overrun the Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. That, in history, marks the end of the Byzantine Empire. Now, all of a sudden, because Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch, for centuries, have been under the control of the Muslim influence, the only remaining sort of Central Eastern patriarchate in the East is Constantinople. When it falls, that's it. The notion of it would be like sacking Rome and the Pope going away and you just never having a Pope again. This is sort of the devastating effect that this had on Byzantium. What happens eventually is the Turkish sultans wind up sort of taking control. That's why it's now called Istanbul and no longer Constantinople. Whoever wins the war gets to name the cities. That's a pretty basic point of military history. You win, you get to put the name on it. And they did. And of the roughly 160 patriarchs that were in Constantinople or Istanbul from the 15th century to the 20th century, to 1923, of roughly those 150 of them, 105 were either appointed or pulled off their throne by the Sultan. By the Sultan. A lot of people don't realize what's going on in the Eastern churches. That is an Eastern church that is being occupied by a non-Christian force for 500 years. Well, the East takes another blow when Ivan the Great, the Tsar of Russia, comes to power. First one to use the name Tsar. You know what Tsar means in Russian? Caesar. All of a sudden, he's the new Caesar. This whole, the Romans did something really well for all of these people centuries and millennia later to want to keep imitating them and taking their names. We have a Senate in the United States. The Roman influence cannot be underestimated or undervalued in history. Everybody wants to be Caesar. Everybody wants to be a senator. The Romans knew where it was as far as like making their mark in history. So Ivan the Great comes along and says, I'm Caesar, I'm the Tsar, and I will be the protector of Christianity in the East. Okay, well, that's all right. For a while, that's all right. Until all of a sudden, Constantinople, Istanbul, the patriarch, is just minimized greatly, and Moscow becomes what historians call the Third Rome. Moscow becomes what historians call the Third Rome, and the seat of orthodoxy, of Eastern Christianity, resides in Moscow for about the last 400 or 500 years. As a matter of fact, today, in the world of Eastern Christianity, about 90% of all Orthodox are Russian Orthodox because of Ivan the Great and all of the constant influence and the tearing at the old Byzantine Empire by the Turkish forces, that most Orthodox today are Russian Orthodox. Yes, there's Greek. There are actually, sadly, 11. There are 11 different Orthodox branches in Eastern Europe and slightly into Asia. Again, because what are you going to do with, there's no central leadership. You've been overrun militarily, you've been thrown out of power, someone else has stepped in and said, I'm going to take your power, I'm going over here back to Moscow with it. The world of Eastern Christianity begins to fragment. There are some theological differences, however, between us. Now, again, most of all that stuff is historical, political, military. We must remember that. But there are theological differences. There are three big ones that separate the Christians in the East and Christians in the West. The first one is called the filioque. Filioque is, now a lot of people make a big deal out of this. It's not a big deal as much as people think it is. Filioque is just Latin saying for and from the Son, and the Son. This really, it's a line that got put in the Creed in the 5th and 6th centuries. It had sort of had a little bit of play in the 4th and 5th century and different, but it sort of got fully adopted in the Creed, and it's the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Stop. That's what it used to say. Now in the West, we have added, and the Son. Well, the Orthodox took exception with that. The Byzantines took exception with that and said, well, wait a minute. You don't have, either that's not right, or even if it is right, the Pope didn't have the authority to stick that in. Because the Pope is just the first among equals. He's just the Patriarch of Rome, like I'm the Patriarch of the East. He doesn't have the authority to do that. The big theological point in there, really now, today, most Orthodox and most Catholic scholars who've studied all of this have said, this really is sort of a distinction without a difference. The origin of the Holy Spirit from the Father, through the Son, and the Son is essentially saying the same thing. Why? Because everything the Son has, He has from the Father. It says that in the Scriptures. Everything the Son has, He has from the Father. So if the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, He also proceeds through the Son, which is the Orthodox way of saying it, and the Son, which is the Western way of saying it. This has been a tempest in a teapot. You know when this really caught on as a big, big division? When the Muslims took over the Byzantine-controlled empire, the Christians in the East, it was the Muslim church that Muslim forces that insisted that the Christian churches in the East make a definitive break with Rome. An awful lot of these breaks and divisions happened at the point of a sword. Break from Rome, and this was one of the points that they needed to have a break with. This is a distinction without a difference, and most scholars today would say that. The second point, theologically, is how many councils have there been? The Orthodox community holds that there have been 7 councils in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the Church. The Catholic Church also holds that those councils were held, that they were ecumenical, they were correct. The Catholic Church just continues counting beyond that up to a total of 22, including Vatican II back in the 1960s. Part of the reason that there is an issue here, if you notice that the Orthodox and the Catholics agree on all this stuff, it's just that the Catholics have a little bit more. The Catholics put in the extra line. The Catholics have some more councils. It's not that what is in agreement is not held in agreement. It's just that the things that have developed over time within Catholicism are what the Orthodox take exception to. One of the problems on counting the councils is that what is an ecumenical council? The Church holds an ecumenical council as one that both the Pope and bishops are present at. Catholic Church holds that. The Orthodox view an ecumenical council as one that the Church agrees to, that all of the churches agree is an ecumenical council. Well, if one of the churches doesn't agree it's an ecumenical council, well then it's not an ecumenical council, sort of by their own definition. That creates a problem in counting. Funny enough, almost all of the theological things that have come forth from those councils, the Orthodox we agree with them on. Again, the theological points we agree on. The one big point that is a stumbling block between unification between the East and the West is the office of the Pope, the papacy. And the problem with that is that the Orthodox, from their traditions back when there were the 5 cities, way back in the first few centuries, saw the Pope, the office of the Pope, the Patriarch of the West, the Bishop of Rome, as first among equals, having a higher place of honor than the other patriarchs, but not having a higher place of authority. And that's the difference. That's where you hear that expression, first among equals, from, meaning we will honor him, give him his due honor and everything because he is the first among equals, but his authority doesn't extend that far. The Catholic Church says, well, that's not the way the Scriptures have pointed it up. Jesus said, clearly made Peter head of the apostles. Every time you go through the Scriptures, through the Gospels, the only time Jesus ever uses the word we, ever, in Scripture, is when he's talking about himself and Peter. It's the only time the word we ever falls from his lips. When he is, after he's risen from the dead and he's visiting with the apostles on the seashore, it's just the apostles sitting there and him, and what does he say? He says to Peter, Peter, do you love me more than these? When he's sitting at the Last Supper, and Peter, I love Peter. I took Peter as my confirmation name because he's one of those, I'll get out of the boat and I'll do anything you want me to, God. And he steps in the water. Yeah, I love you. Oh, I'm drowning. Love Peter. He's so human. Peter's awesome. Peter's awesome. But Big Mouth Peter, once again, sorry, while you were on earth, Big Mouth Peter is standing there at the Last Supper, and Jesus says, oh, it's written, tonight I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And Peter's like, oh, no, not me, Lord. No matter what all the rest of these do, I will die for it. I will stand by you and I will die. And Jesus turns to Peter and goes, Peter, I have prayed for you because Satan wants to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you so that when you regain your strength, you in turn may strengthen your brothers. Peter was the head of the apostles by authority also. Not meaning he got to just give him orders and do whatever he wants. He was picked by Jesus probably because of his weakness and everything else, but also because of his intense love. But Peter was the head of the apostles. That's clear in Scripture. Every time there's a list, Peter's at the head of it. Who walked out and preached first on Pentecost Sunday after? Peter did. When there was a dispute that had to be settled over circumcision, and should we keep having all the Gentiles who are coming into the church, should they live by the law of Moses, or can we exempt them from it because they're not Jewish? Peter was who they went to settle the question. Peter had authority. To you I give the keys of the kingdom of heaven, Peter, right there in the presence of the other apostles, and the you is a singular you. To you I give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. It is a relationship between Jesus, the founder and establisher of the Catholic Church, and Peter as the head of that church, visible head of that church on earth. But all of that said, what divides us doesn't even begin to hold a candle to what unites us. The church in the West, the Catholic Church, the Latin Rite Church in the West, owes an incredible debt to our brothers and sisters in the East. We owe an incredible debt to our brothers and sisters in the East. To show how far we have advanced to this point, 1965, Pope Paul and I believe it was Bartholomew I actually lifted that silly excommunication from the year 1054. They didn't have to do that. And it was like, oh, well, they probably said in some formal highfalutin church language, we were kind of stupid. Yeah, we were kind of stupid too. So just, don't let anybody know. Yeah, here, you're not excommunicated and you're not excommunicated anymore. Let's go have a beer. Let's go have some wine. Isn't it good to be Catholic and Orthodox? We get to drink. If you're going to have a Reformation, have a real one. 1995, John Paul and the Patriarch actually celebrate Mass together. They concelebrate Mass together. Almost 1,000 years later, standing at the same altar, saying the same prayers, calling Jesus down, calling the Holy Spirit, making Jesus present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. We are ridiculous, Catholics and Orthodox. We are ridiculous if we don't see we need to join hands again. It's just stupid, and it's a sin if we don't. I'm telling you, it's a sin if we don't. What do we have in common? A lot more than what we realize we have in common. The doctors of the church is like a hall of fame for our Eastern brothers and sisters. Half of those doctors of the church are from the East that we quote all the time supporting Roman Catholic theology. St. Jerome, St. Athanasius, St. John Chrysostom. The list is endless. 33 doctors of the church, probably half of them are from the East, if not more. We need to recognize as Catholics, this is what an incredible gift and richness we have with our brothers and sisters over there on the eastern side of Europe. When we were fighting the barbarians in the east, they were fighting in the west. They were fighting heresies, far worse than barbarians, in the east. They were remaining truthful and faithful, fighting those heresies. Granted, a number of them crept up in the east, but the point is they were also killed in the east. We owe a great deal to our brothers and sisters in the Eastern Orthodox churches. They defended and believed in the humanity and divinity simultaneously of Jesus Christ. They defended and believed in Mary, the great Mother of God, Theotokos, God-bearer. They gave us that term. They defended and believed in the necessity for the grace of for salvation. These were all ideas obviously coming along into the West and also developing, but they originated in the East. The great doctors of the church, the great minds of the church, the fathers of the church, this all came to us from the East. They defended and believed in human will, in the freedom of human will, something Luther and Calvin would come along centuries later and deny. They kept that belief. They believed in apostolic succession, that the bishops who were sitting there in their offices as bishop, appointing and ordaining priests, that they are the successors of the apostles. They taught that, something that Luther and Calvin threw overboard. They believed and defended the sacrifice of the Mass, of the Holy Mass. They believed and defended the real presence of Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Holy Eucharist. They believed and defended and kept a tender, loving devotion to our Blessed Mother and the saints. We are the heirs of this in the West. We are the participators of it, certainly. Didn't all begin and end in the East. But all of this was being upheld and moved along and developed in the East, while the West was still sort of struggling to stand up and sort of get on its own 2 feet. Every time we sort of got up, another barbarian invasion would come. We owe a great gratitude of debt and love to the East, as brothers and sisters should owe and should recognize. There has never been a time where we need ecumenism, true ecumenism, more than we need it now. Look at the world around us. Look at the world around us. We have never seen a world like this. Part of the reason the world is like this is because we have not done what we were supposed to do. We have not remained faithful. We have not remained faithful. Guilty as charged. How many times have you let a comment go at work that defamed your faith? Guilty as charged. How many times have you let a friend say something that you knew wasn't the truth, and you knew that it probably would have offended Jesus, and if you could see Jesus or His Blessed Mother standing right there, you probably would have said something, but you chose to kind of bury it because you didn't want to get into it. Forest fires, these horrible forest fires in Southern California, all begin with one spark. We have not done what we have needed to do. We have not been an example in our personal lives, nor have our churches been the example they need to be on the big sort of official thing. We need to solve this issue. Imagine what the world could be like if 1.2 billion Roman Catholics and 350 to 400 million Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, got together and said, we are going to be completely one faith, one truth, worship with one voice. And we will tell you, secular humanists, to take your smut out of our party stores, to get your garbage off those televisions that's polluting our children's minds, to get rid of all of your sin and your filth and your flesh and your devil and get the hell out of here. But we can't do that as long as we remain divided. We must change our hearts. Catholics must realize and accept that we have to say what we have to say that is the truth. And there is no truthful ecumenism without union with the Pope. Period. Say that flat, say that clear. There is no true ecumenism without the Pope. That said, that must not be ever said in any form of arrogance or we're right and you're not, ha ha ha, or even given that kind of impression. We have to understand that many, many, many people in the West did an awful lot of things to hurt and offend our brothers and sisters in the East. John Paul stood on the stage of the world at the turn of the millennium and apologized for all of these things. And if our leader, who we say, there he is, the Vicar of Christ, if he does it, we should be doing it. That said, our Orthodox brothers and sisters have to say the same thing. They also have to experience the humility of heart and say, an awful lot of what's gone on here has gone on because of our pride as well. The larger picture here is not who's right and who's wrong. The larger picture is the will of Jesus Christ, who we both profess as our Savior, who we both go and worship at the altar through the same apostolic succession, so that when he says, Father, I pray that they all may be one, as you and I are one, so that the world may know that you sent me, so that we both believe that. And the distinctions and the differences we have between us, the world no longer sees because they're simply no longer there. That is our charge. We are commanded by our blessed Lord to behave this way. We need to figure out a way to do it. We're going to come back right after this and take some questions from our studio audience. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the One True Faith. This is part of the show where we get questions from our studio audience. Our topic today is the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Catholic churches. Sir, you have a Catholic church. You have a question for us. What's your name and where are you from?
Yes, my name's John Snyder. I'm from the National Shrine of Little Flower. Who's the head of the Eastern or the Orthodox Church? I know in the West it would be the Pope.
Mm-hmm. The Orthodox churches, there's, like we said, there's sort of 11 different, call them communions, but 11 different churches. Each one of them has a patriarch, and the patriarch of each of those churches sort of speaks for me. If you're asking for like who's the Pope of Orthodoxy, yes. There isn't a Pope of Orthodoxy. There are patriarchs of each of the different churches, and in that sense, that's the person who speaks on behalf of that particular church. But there is the idea of somebody who's over all of the rites and all of the non-Catholic but Orthodox churches. That person doesn't exist. There isn't one. It's just the patriarch of each of the different churches. Most of the churches are sort of aligned along nationalistic lines. So this is the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Romanian Orthodox Church. Their history is after the Turks sort of overran the Byzantine Empire, they began to break apart along nationalistic lines. So each church is headed by its own patriarch.
Okay, thank you. The next one would be, how would you envision the Eastern and the Western Church getting back together?
I would say that if there is one thing that the West and the East have in great stock, and a lot of different things, but I would make an appeal to, I would follow what John Paul said, and we both have the same mother, and both sides have a tremendous love for Our Lady. And I've got to imagine, as any mom, when she sees two brothers or two sisters, two siblings fighting, particularly over something that's kind of stupid, that she says, it breaks my heart to see you guys fighting like this. Come back together. I really think if both churches, and I'm not talking about bishops and popes and patriarchs, I'm talking about us down here, include in your Holy Communions at the end a special prayer to Our Lady to say, bring us back together like your son and our brother wanted, Blessed Mother. Because the Orthodox have such a tremendous love for Our Lady. And the West could probably learn to recapture some of that love, as a matter of fact, in our heavy secular world. So I would say if we made appeal, moms have a tremendous way of fixing problems in families, and that's where I would head.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. How you doing, sir? What's your name and where are you from?
Roy Shaner, I'm from St. Mary Queen of Creation in New Baltimore.
How you doing, Roy?
Good. Question is, The word Orthodox, what's the origin and the significance of the word Orthodox?
It comes from the Greek. It just means like right teaching, as opposed to say heterodox, which means not in the false teaching or many variations on the same teaching. In the sense that it's applied to the Eastern churches, like capital O Orthodox, it corresponds to our Roman Catholic. But in the small o sense of it, it just means that the teaching that you're holding and believing and preaching is the right teaching. So in that sense, you can speak of the Orthodox teaching of the Catholic Church, just not a big capital O. And lots of times, particularly in the last 15 or 20 years, and there's so much how shall we say, consternation in the Western Church over, what you're teaching is heretical, what you're teaching is Orthodox. Sometimes the term Orthodox, capital O, as it's applied to the East, gets mixed up with the small o Orthodox as we refer to specific teachings and how we talk about them in the Western churches. But Orthodox just means right teaching, correct teaching, right belief. But it sometimes gets a little confusing because the word has two different applications in the 21st century, but that's the origin of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name and where are you from?
Hi, I'm Mary Wozniak, and I'm with St. Aidan's in Livonia. And my question is, what are our Eastern Rite Catholic churches or our Eastern Catholic churches, and are they considered Orthodox?
The Eastern Rite Catholic churches are under the umbrella of Roman Catholicism. They are under obedience and under the Pope, but they celebrate Mass and the sacraments with different rites. Those rites look an awful lot like some of the Orthodox churches and how they celebrate the sacraments, but they are not Orthodox churches. The major difference, again, being that these are different rites. In the West, we call it the Latin Rite, which is Mass used to be said in Latin, and the official language of the Church was Latin. Now, since Vatican II, it's the vernacular, but we still refer to ourselves as the Latin Rite. All of the other rites in the Catholic Church are under the umbrella of the Oriental rites. There's the Maronite and different rites along down the list like that. But they are all still Catholic. They still answer to the Pope. They still profess the Roman Catholic faith. They just, in their sacraments and their liturgies, they have different rites for them. The Orthodox rites look very similar in many cases, but the Orthodox churches are not Roman Catholic. They are Orthodox, and that actually, unfortunately, is the division that we have between us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
I'm Frank from Dearborn Heights.
Hello, Frank.
Hello.
He said hello, too.
Following up on the previous question, if the Eastern Catholic churches have rites very similar to what the Eastern Orthodox churches have, might they be some sort of a bridge to bring this unity between the two lungs, as Pope John Paul said, the lung of the East and the lung of the West?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of a mystery to me why a lot of this hasn't already happened. Seriously, you really think about it. I mean, the list we went through earlier, you could tick off, you could fill a room with the number of things we agree on, and there's a couple of things, they're not minor, but there's just a couple of things. If you have this much agreement on everything, can't you just, get the burr out from under your saddle and go just, do what you need to do to fix the rest of it? As far as we share, I mean, that's a very good point. We share this visually and in the celebration of the sacraments, the East and the West sort of meet in the Eastern Rite Catholic churches as far as their languages, their use of all the sacramentals, the look, the feel of it, and as a matter of fact, I'm telling you, the West could use a little sort of liturgical, refab from looking at our Orthodox brothers and sisters as well as our Eastern Rite churches. The awe, the respect, all of that's present in those Eastern churches, both Eastern Rite Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. They still have the mystery, the awe, the reverence that we've sort of lost in the West. We're very minimalistic now, very secular, very, build our churches that look like a firebox and a firehouse or something, and then just everybody get in and get out as fast as you can, and leave, come 20 minutes late, leave 10 minutes early, and sing some silly hymn on a guitar and get out the door. That doesn't exist in the East, and that might be that could actually be not only a bridge between the Orthodox and Orthodox churches of the East and the Catholic churches of the West. It could also be a way to sort of refurbish and reinvigorate the liturgy of the West, because even Pope Benedict is really making a point about this. The liturgy is really kind of taking it right on the chops in the last 40 years.
Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Frank. Be right back right after this. I want to conclude today by saying that we have to come back to this point in the division that exists, in those gaps that exist. If you look down those dark holes, you'll see a demon staring back at you. That is the method that Satan has used from time immemorial: divide and conquer. And if we aren't holy enough, if we don't pray, make a virtual intention right now that from now on, every single time that you go to Holy Communion, you will offer up part of that communion with Christ. And as Catholics and Orthodox, we are receiving our blessed Savior, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Make a virtual intention right now. If you're sitting at home, right now, make a virtual intention as part of your prayer that this division end. When Jesus came and said, "I've come to bring the sword," he didn't mean the sword of division along these lines. He meant the sword of truth, and the sword that would say, I'm baptized, I'm a Christian, I believe in everything that the church teaches, and I'm going to defend it. One of the things the church teaches is everything that Jesus said, and that is, Father, I pray that they all may be one, just as you and I are one, so the world may know that you sent me. Pray for an end to the division. Pray to our Blessed Mother. Offer up your Holy Communions. And there are so many things we can do together. There's so many things we can do together. Both of our religions recognize the horrible evil and scar of abortion. Pick up the phone and call a friend who's Orthodox. Go to your pastor, your Catholic pastor, or go to your Orthodox pastor and say, hey, call St. Bobby down the street, and let's go get a prayer of Orthodox and Catholic in front of that abortion clinic and pray for an end to abortion. There's so many social evils and horrors in the world. Move, get up off our rear ends and go help fix them. That's what we're called to do. And when we're both doing something holy with each other, watch the differences begin to melt away, because you're chasing Satan out. And believe me, when Satan is gone, Jesus and his Blessed Mother, you're the saints, the angels that we all worship, and all don't worship the saints, you know what I mean. Worship God and all the angels and saints. All of these come to us. They will be there for us. They will bring back the unity, because it is the will of God that that unity exists. That is our responsibility. Pick up the phone, call your pastor, say, hey, there's an Orthodox church down the road. If you're Orthodox, pick up the phone, call the priest there and say, hey, there's a Catholic church down the road. You know what? We really should be brothers and sisters and at least fighting evil, okay? We can figure out the Pope thing next year, 2 years, 5 years from now, a council, whatever. In the meantime, let's help each other get to heaven, right? Can I hear an amen, people? Amen. All right. All right. Well, that wraps up the show for this week. We'll see you next week on The One True Faith. Thank you.